Tenemos la ponencia principal del día a cargo del profesor Edouard Machery, que es doctor en filosofía por la Universidad de Sorbona, profesor de filosofía en la Universidad de Pittsburgh y director del Centro de Filosofía de la Ciencia. Su investigación se centra en las cuestiones filosóficas planteadas por las ciencias cognitivas. Su investigación actual se centra en la metodología de la psicología experimental, con un enfoque especial en las pruebas de significación, de replicación, medición y los problemas de estadística. Sus proyectos de investigación y publicaciones recientes incluyen la naturaleza y el origen de la categorización racial, la aplicación de las teorías evolutivas a la cognición humana, la naturaleza de la cultura y la estructura de los conceptos morales. Está involucrado en el desarrollo de la filosofía experimental y ha utilizado métodos experimentales y cuasi experimentales para estudiar intuiciones sobre referencia, juicios populares sobre acción intencional, causalidad, el concepto popular de raza y el concepto popular de conciencia fenoménica. La ponencia del profesor Machery esta noche se titula La geografía de la filosofía, algunas cosas que hemos aprendido y algunas limitaciones. Démosle la bienvenida al profesor Machery.
All right, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Again, apologies. I will be talking in English this evening. I wouldn't want to impose the 3 words of Spanish I know on you. But most of the slides are actually in Spanish, so that should also help some of you follow the lecture if you have a hard time following my English, which is of course made more complicated by the fact that I'm a French speaker, so it's English with a French accent. All right. So anyway, my goal today is to describe the Geography of Philosophy project, explain what the motivations behind the project were. We've already seen some of that earlier today in Pablo's introduction, as well as in Veli's first talk. And also to review some of our results on wisdom, which will give you a sense of what it is we've been trying to do and some of the products of the research, as well as maybe some of the limitations of the type of work we've been able to do. And maybe during the Q&A, we can talk about those limitations of the project and what we could do better, or how it could have been done better. All right, so here is the structure of the talk. I will first tell you a little bit about a philosophical question, which is the challenge that diversity raises for some important questions in philosophy. And this project is in large part anchored or rooted in this challenge. Then I will say a few things about the Geography of Philosophy project, going quite quickly about that because it very much overlaps with what Pablo described this morning in his introduction to the workshop. And then I will focus on 2 studies that we have been conducting about the concept of wisdom, about how lay people think about wisdom, what it means to be a wise person, and what it means to make a wise choice. And I will try to present the studies as clearly as I can, and describe the results that we have. And then we'll move to the discussion of these results and what they show about universality or diversity about in philosophical concepts. Let's start with the first section. So what I call the diversity challenge can be described in a very simple manner. It is just the idea or the hypothesis that different groups, for example, different cultures, but it could be also men and women, or it could be people across different social classes, or it could be people living in a city versus people living in the countryside. So different demographic groups are sensitive to different considerations that bear on philosophical ideas or concepts. And it's a possibility that very few philosophers, until maybe the 1980s, have considered seriously and extensively. So what could it mean, for example? Well, it could mean, for example, that what it means to justify or to give reasons for a view, a belief, an opinion, an assertion varies across groups. So you know that for one group to justify means this, while for another group to justify means that. Or it could mean that what it means to know varies across groups. For example, it could be that what it means to know varies dramatically across culture. And that when a given cultural entity says that they know something, by the standard of another culture, there is no knowledge there, and vice versa. Or it could be that what it means to lie varies dramatically across cultures. And indeed, we've done a lot of work on both knowledge and lying in our project. In the moral domain, you find the same type of ideas. What is required for blaming or praising actions might vary dramatically across various demographic groups. It might be, for example, that praise and blame vary across genders, that men and women, just to speculate, do not use the same considerations to decide whether someone is blameworthy or praiseworthy. It's a possibility at the very least. The same thing for what it means to have a good life. It might be that the ideal of a good life is not the same if you live in a small-scale society or in an industrialized society, in a capitalist context or in a non-capitalist context, in a market-integrated environment or in a non-market integrated environment. All these factors might dramatically shape what it means to live a good life. It's at the very least possible, right? The same is true for what responsibility requires, what it means to be not responsible. In most legal contexts, whenever you have explicit legal codes, there are provisions that determine when someone is not responsible for an action. For example, madness is one reason where someone is not going to be responsible for an action. But it could be that non-responsibility varies dramatically across contexts, across cultural groups, for example, and so on and so forth. Now, why does it matter? I think it matters for philosophy for the following reason. And the reason is that most contemporary philosophers, and in fact most philosophers, when they theorize about the themes we've been talking about, freedom, responsibility, lying, knowledge, justification, having reasons for one's views, are mostly, and I think I would claim only, sensitive to the epistemic and moral considerations that matters for Westerners. And I think it's quite clear that there is not even, there is very rarely, I should say, discussion of the possibility that these considerations might vary, and that in fact it might be a mistake to anchor our discussions of let's say, responsibility, blame, and praiseworthiness on the considerations that are more salient to Westerners. Now, one might think that it's wrong to make this assumption that the relevant considerations are the ones that matter to Westerners. But I think it's wrong on two different grounds. It's wrong on moral grounds. If you consider reasons of fairness and justice, you might think that at the very least, as a starting point, all considerations should be brought to discussion. Even if at the end of a reflection, you end up with choosing a few of these reflections, at the very least, we should consider a diverse set of reflections as a starting point of our reflective process. So on the ground of justice or fairness, there's something mistaken in the idea of selecting from the get-go a subset of considerations. It's also wrong for reasons for epistemic reasons, right? One might think that it's unlikely that the true or the relevant considerations happen just by chance to be the ones that we Western philosophers happen to be sensitive to. What's the odds that it's always the one we Western philosophers happen to be sensitive to that are the relevant one to theorize about what a good life is, what responsibility is, and so on and so forth. So on epistemic ground, starting with a more diverse set of considerations is more likely to lead us toward the most... I should speak to that. Towards the most relevant consideration for theorizing in philosophy. All right? Now, this idea is not new. In fact, one of the co-PI of the Geography of Philosophy project, Steve Stitch, who was here a few years ago in a workshop that Pablo had already organized, has been defending this idea for now decades. So in a quite well-known paper published in 1985, Could Man Be an Irrational Animal? Stitch writes as follows. So he notices that in linguistics, it's quite common to agree that different speakers across languages will have different grammars. You know, speakers of French, like me, have internalized an implicit knowledge of the grammar of French. Speakers of Quechua have internalized another grammar, the grammar of Quechua. But he notices that philosophers, and including the philosopher he has in mind, Cohen, haven't been really sensitive to the hypothesis, that is a possibility, that our cognitive, there could be the same variation for cognition. Here's what he writes. Yet, on Cohen's account of the empirical theory of reasoning, there is no mention of different people having different idealized competences, by which he means cognitive competences. Rather, he seems to assume that in the domain of reasoning, all people have exactly the same competence. But why should we not expect that cognitive competence will vary just as much as linguistic competence? And then he goes on, whether or not individuals, social groups, or cultures differ in their cognitive competence is an empirical question. You know, already literally 40 years ago, Stitch was pointing out it's an empirical matter. There's no other way to find out the truth than by doing empirical work. On all fours with a parallel question about linguistic consequence. It is a question to be settled by the facts about intuitions and practice, not by a priori philosophical argument. Right, so this is the idea that one formulation of the diversity challenge. This challenge was also very instrumental in the birth of what is now known as experimental philosophy. So one of the development in modern philosophy in the early 21st century was a growth of this tradition now called experimental philosophy, where philosophers use experimental methods often drawn from psychology to study empirical facts that are philosophically significant. And that is one of the first papers in this tradition, Normativity and Epistemic Intuition by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch. And there too, they notice that it's totally possible that Westerners and East Asians are sensitive to different epistemic considerations, and they try to provide evidence for this hypothesis. It's not, however, it's important to see that it's not just experimental philosophers who have been interested in the hypothesis that there might be tremendous variation in the kind of considerations that are relevant to do philosophy. People who work on comparative philosophy, who compare different philosophical traditions, have long argued that comparing philosophy, for example, between China and Greece, or India and Europe, and so on and so forth, is important because there are philosophical concerns that are ignored in the West, for example, but that are extremely salient in other contexts. Cooperman, who works on Confucian philosophy, writes, for example, that a major reason that Confucius should matter to Western ethical philosophers is that some of his concerns are markedly different from those most common in the West. So, for example, one of the things that's very important in Confucian philosophy is rituals, and the moral significance of rituals. And if you just look at Western moral philosophy, you will not find any sophisticated discussion of why rituals do matter for living a good life. If you want to think very hardly about the moral significance of rituals to be living a good life, you need to look at Confucian philosophy, so at non-Western philosophy, because the moral interests are extremely different from the one that many Western philosophers have had. Feminist philosophers have often made the very same points. There's a very classic book by Carol Gilligan, where Gilligan argues that men and women are sensitive to different ethical considerations, and that the dominant shape of moral philosophy in the West is driven by the fact that it has been written by men. And if women had been writing moral philosophy, it would take a very different shape. Impartiality, for example, would be much less significant if moral philosophy had been written by women. Now, I do not know whether that claim is true. It does not really matter whether it's true. What matters is the idea that moral and epistemic considerations might vary substantially across demographic groups, and that it matters for us philosophers. Right? We philosophers cannot afford to ignore the possibilities that these considerations are quite diverse and vary across demographic groups, be they cultures, genders, socioeconomic groups, and so on and so forth. So that's the challenge, right? This is, and why it does matter for philosophy. All right, this was not good. This is not good either. All right. So the Geography of Philosophy project was in part meant to deal with the diversity challenge. The diversity challenge, when it was first formulated by Stitch in the early 1980s, was more of a hypothesis. It was more, in a sense, to challenge the way philosophers, mostly analytic philosophers, were doing philosophy. In the early 2000s, as like the beginning of the 21st century, this challenge was turned into an empirical project with experimental philosophy, but of a very small scale. One study here, one study there, quite amateurish, frankly. So the idea of the Geography of Philosophy project was to take very seriously the idea that the question at the end of the day is empirical, that it's of extreme importance for philosophy, and that we must try to be addressing it. So that's some of our media we've been using in case you're still interested. The website, the Facebook page, the Twitter. Now it's been dormant because now the project is over, but we occasionally put some information out there. The PI, we've already mentioned them. The one that is not here today that I really wanted to highlight is Steve Stitch, since he was unable to come, since he's actually about to retire. I wanted to mention him. And again, as I did this morning, I wanted to thank all the PI, all the team leaders that have actually made this project possible, in particular Pablo, who is our host today. This is a site where we've been collecting data. Japan, South Korea, China, India, in 3 different languages, Meitei, Hindi, and I believe Bengali. South Africa in 3 different languages, Afrikaans, Zulu, and another one which I'm blocking on right now. Well, that's Sifedi. Thanks, Clark. Sifedi, that's right. Morocco, where we collected the data in Moroccan Arabic. Slovakia, but we collected data really from all over Eastern Europe, from Slovakia to Russia to Ukraine and other places. We collected, of course, data in North America. We collected data in South America in 2 different countries, Ecuador and Peru. And in both countries, we collected data in various languages. In Peru, we collected some data in Spanish, some data in Quechua, some data in Shipibo, I believe. These are only 3 languages, right? All right. And in Ecuador, we collected data also in several languages. Shiwiya was one of them, and also some data in Spanish as well. So we have, as you can see, quite a diverse range of populations and groups that we've been trying to work with. And as Pablo explained this morning, we focus on 3 concepts: the concept of knowledge, the concept of wisdom, which I will be focusing on in the rest of the talk, and the concept of understanding. Why this concept, you might ask? It's a really good question. Why this concept? Well, for various reasons. One of them is, of course, that knowledge is a central concept in Western epistemology. So we wanted to really look at a concept that has been so central for philosophy since Plato until nowadays. Also, there are linguistic and psychological reasons why it's a good thing to focus on the concept of knowledge. So, while the word knowledge is not universal, some linguists at least claim that the verb to know with some form of propositional clause, so to know that, is found in every language. Now, so the clause itself varies, the way it's formulated varies across languages, but the idea is that there's to know plus a proposition. The claim is that that is found in every language we know of. So that's a claim that, for example, Wierzbicka has been making in her work for a very long time. So it seems to be a good target, right? So it's a concept that we might be able to find in many different languages, but maybe with different meanings across languages and cultures. There's also another reason to focus on the concept of knowledge, is that it's a concept that in the life of a child emerges very quickly. In contrast to other mentalistic concepts, 2-year-olds so really children, already draw a distinction between knowing and ignoring. It's actually the first mentalistic concept that they happen to be using, distinguishing you know something from you don't know something, you have no knowledge of that thing. At 3-year-olds, they add other mentalistic terms, and they draw a contrast between knowing and thinking in terms of activity at 4-year-olds. So what we have evidence here of quite an early development of a sense of knowledge in children. So it seems to be a concept that's found in many, if not all languages, a concept that develops very early on. So I think a good target for trying to do some cross-cultural work about its exact meaning in different places. Why did we have understanding and wisdom? Well, for various reasons, but one of them is that they are related, but interestingly different from knowledge. Right? There are wisdom, for example, in some languages is used as its roots the word related for knowledge. So there are interesting relations and differences between this concept, and also the work on understanding and wisdom is very limited. There's really no cross-cultural work, no cross-linguistic work. So this seemed to be a good target for our research. So our goal was to try to get a better grasp of these three concepts, and also to try to develop, if we find variation, to try to develop some explanatory hypothesis of this variation. It's one thing to find variation, it's another one to understand the variation. It's actually often much easier to observe variation than to have a sense of why there is any variation at all in any aspects of the mind. So our initial goal, maybe which was a little bit naive, but it was not only to document any variation that we might find, but to try to provide some explanation of why there is such variation. And we've tried to use various methods to do so. We have some vignette studies. Many of our studies involve presenting some text and asking participants to answer some questions based on the text. But we also had some qualitative interviews that we're still developing, and we also have done some corpus studies that are also on the way to being developed. We tried to have a group of sites that was quite diverse, even so, it was not nearly as diverse as it should have been, and the diversity was not as controlled as it could have been. But we have sites that are industrialized, like the USA or China, for example, and Japan or Korea, and sites that are less industrialized, such as, for example, some the Shiwiya, for example, in Ecuador, which are less industrialized, obviously, than some parts of China. And we tried also to give due to linguistic and religious diversity. So we have Muslim and Hindu and Christian cultures in our sample. All right. So that's to give you the background. And all of that, again, this quite large project was meant to try to address empirically, as Stitch had called us to do, the diversity challenge, at least to some extent. Now, what I want to do in the next half an hour is to present two studies that illustrate the kind of work we've done. And both are on wisdom, so on one of the three concepts we've been examining. So the first study is, what does it mean to be a wise person? And so bear with me, I'm going to describe the experiment. I think at this point, if you've got questions, it will be a good time to interrupt me so that you have a good sense of the experiment that we've run before I present the data. All right? So bear with me. So here are our participants. We collected data from India in 3 languages, data from China in Mandarin, Korea and Japan, Korean and Japanese, of course, South Africa in 3 languages, Morocco in Arabic, Slovakia in Slovakian, North America, and South America. For statistical reasons, we had to merge together some of the samples. We could not treat each sample separately. So we did not distinguish, for example, data from Africans from data from CPD in that analysis for statistical reasons. I'm happy to explain that a little bit later, but I wanted to mention that. Now, the study involves 10 characters. And here they are. You, or in that case me, a 12-year-old and a 45-year-old, which are control characters. And then there are 7 more characters which were chosen because they have some connection with wisdom. Right? If you ask people to give some example of wise individuals, sometimes, or actually quite often, they mention some of these people. So for example, you can have a religious person, an older person, often associated with wisdom. You can have a teacher, you can have a scientist, fair person, someone who is fair and just, a doctor. One which is a bit more surprising is a politician. And as you will see, it's not necessarily the best example of a wise person. I'll give you some evidence about that a little bit later. But our choice started with the idea that these seven characters might have some form of connection to wisdom. All right? Each character was described with a short sentence. And I'll give you an example of the short sentence that describes the character. Now, let's suppose that you're a participant to the study. The way it works is that you're given one of these characters. For example, you're given a scientist. The scientist has a name, and she's described by a sentence. Right? Blah, blah, blah is a scientist. She does this and that. And then you will be asked to compare that person to the 9 other characters. And that comparison will be along 19 behaviors. Right? So and let me show you what the 19 behaviors are. So you will be asked to compare, for example, the scientist and the politician, then the scientist and the religious person, then the scientist and the teacher, the scientist and the 75-year-old, along these 19 dimensions. So you have to decide whether the scientist is more likely to show pride in themselves than the politician, is more likely to show pride in themselves than the religious person, is more likely to show pride in themselves than the 12-year-old, and so on and so forth. All for that for the 19 dimension. So here's how it works, for example. Let's suppose that the character you've been assigned is you, and you have to compare you to the 9 other characters. So for example, at some point you will be asked, John is a 75-year-old person who has a lot of life experience and many stories to share. And then you're supposed to compare John and you along the 19 dimensions I've already mentioned. Does that make sense for everyone? Is that clear what the study? So as you can see, it's actually quite a time-intensive study. It's actually probably a little bit boring for participants to do, but they bear with us. All right. In addition, we did ask participants to tell us how wise the 10 characters were. Right? So we tell them, let's the 75-year-old described by the following sentence, how wise that person is, and so on and so forth for the 10 characters. How knowledgeable they are, and how much understanding they have. All right? Okay, that's for the study. Clear? No question about the study? Good. So let me move to the results now. The first thing we did is to try to get a sense of how these 19 dimensions that we use for comparison cluster together. Right? Do they form 2, 3, 4 different natural groups? Right? And to do that, we used we factor analyzed the data to simplify a little bit the analysis. And what emerged are 2 dimensions. One which we call reflective orientation, one which we call socio-emotional awareness, which we could call empathy as well. The reflective orientations, these are the dimensions of comparison that really correlate with these dimensions. So for example, thinking before acting, thinking in many ways, thinking logically, applying experience, controlling emotion, all of that are really expression of this one dimension there, right? They're really just different ways of saying the same thing. By contrast, those dimensions of comparison, among the 19 dimensions of comparison, care for others' feeling, intellectual humility, pay attention to emotions, giving neutral advice, sense of humor, are all expression of the other dimension, empathy, or what we call in the paper, socio-emotional awareness. So what emerges here is that when one looks at a character and when one compares 2 characters, the comparison is really boils down to these 2 dimensions. One compares whether one of the person is more reflective than the other, and one compare whether this person has more empathy, one might say, than the other. All right? At least in the type of settings that we have. Now, a very important result that I think must be highlighted here is that we did compare whether this structure here, the fact that two dimensions emerge, is stable across the sites we had. So we used a tool in statistics called measurement invariance to assess whether or not we find the same structure across different sites. And the important result is that this structure is robust across sites. So the clustering that you find here is found robustly across all the sites we got data from. All right? Suggesting there might be perhaps some universal dimension in the comparison of characters at least along the 19 dimension we started with. Here's another way of representing roughly what I've told you. So instead of plotting them in two dimension, in a two-dimensional space, we can create a network of the 19, in fact 16, because we removed 3 of them. I can come back to in the Q&A if you're interested why, of the dimensions of comparison. And as you can see, those dimensions of comparisons are the ones that cluster together, as measured by the size of the links connecting the nodes. Those dimensions cluster together as measured by the size of the links connecting the nodes. These are the ones related to empathy. These are the ones related to empathy. These are the ones related to reflectiveness. Right? So it's another way of presenting the same data. Right? That when we compare two people, there are 2 dimensions that come to mind. Whether one is more reflective than the other, whether one has more empathy than the other. All right? Okay, so that's so one result here is the existence of these 2 dimensions. A second result is the fact that these 2 dimensions seems robust across the sites that we've been observing. There's some interesting variation that we find also in that study. So what I've told you about here speak to the lack of variation, but there's also some interesting variation that was found in that study. And the variation comes from the relations between these 2 dimensions of assessment, reflectiveness and empathy, one might say. In some cultures, the 2 are heavily correlated. So the more reflective you are, the more empathetic you are. It goes together. The less reflective you are, the less empathetic you are. So for example, in India, China, and Korea, these 2 dimensions are really very heavily correlated with one another. However, in other countries, at other sites, the correlation, while real, is much weaker. Of interest is the fact that in South America, while the 2 dimensions are related, so the correlation between how reflective one is and how empathetic one is actually much lower than it is, for example, in East Asia. Right? So there is a correlation, but people here in South America don't immediately think that if you're a more reflective person, more likely to think logically, you immediately relate better to people's emotions, right? I think there's much more disconnect between these 2 aspects of comparing individuals. By contrast, in Asia, according to our data anyway, people don't seem to be clearly distinguishing these 2 aspects of comparison between people. So that's an interesting aspect of cultural variation that we've observed in this paper. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of our goals was to try to make sense of these results. I do not have any speculation to offer about why that is the case, but I'd be happy if some of you have speculations about why there is this interesting variation. I'd be happy to hear proposals about that. Now, remember we started with 10 characters. Now we have this 2-dimensional space, reflectivity and empathy, so we can plot our 10 characters and see how reflective and empathetic they are according to lay people. This is you. You are, according to participants, quiet and empathetic person. And you're not so bad in terms of reflection, even though there are more reflective individuals than you. Notice that, as we had expected, we have quite a large cluster of people who are actually quite reflective and empathetic. These are our exemplars of wisdom. And politicians happens to be much less empathetic than what we had expected. They're less good example of wisdom than we had expected. Thinking back, Trump should have told me that maybe politicians were not a great example of wise individuals anyway. So it's not that surprising, really, that they are a little bit different from the other exemplars of wisdom. The 12-year-old that we use as a control, right, shows the right result. The 12-year-old is low on reflectiveness and low on empathy. Something that's actually worth noting here is, again, the position of you. People here think quite highly of themselves, as you might see, particularly when it comes to their empathetic nature. People view themselves as actually among the most empathetic characters that they can find. But empathy and reflectiveness work quite differently, right? So while people view themselves as quite empathetic, they don't necessarily view themselves as extremely reflective. Again, here that's an interesting difference, and I'm not quite sure what explains the distinction here between empathy on the one hand and reflectiveness in people's self-representation, self-concept. But that's an interesting finding that emerges from these results. Okay, I'll skip that. Well, I'll mention that to you. So remember, we had asked participants to judge how wise the 10 characters were. And what you can see here is that the more high on reflective orientation one is, the wiser one is judged to be, right? So the teacher is very high on reflectivity, she's judged wiser. The 12-year-old is low on reflectivity, he's judged to have very low wisdom. The way empathy or social emotional awareness works is really interesting. It interacts with reflectiveness. What that means is when you're very high on reflectiveness, being empathetic makes you even wiser. This is Solomon, right? Solomon is someone who is very reflective. In addition, he has a good understanding of people's emotional life. You know, this is Solomon's trial. He's going to use people's emotion in order to find out who the real mother is. By contrast, if you're low in reflectivity, being empathetic makes you less wise. And we can actually see why. Who is low on reflectivity and very empathetic? Well, fools are like that. Or children, right? Children are, by example, people who can be very empathetic with their environment, but very low on reflectivity. So whether or not being empathetic contributes to your wisdom just depends on how reflective you are. It's a plus if you're very reflective, it's a minus if you happen to be not reflective. Now, what about variations across our sites? Of particular interest here today is the data from South America. And as you can see, the data from South America are quite similar here from the data, for example, from the US. And they're quite similar from the data with the whole sample, where U is judged to be quite high on empathy, quite high on reflectiveness, but less than other participants. Politicians is again the outlier, so I guess your politicians are better than ours. And you have roughly the same group of instance exemplars of wisdom that you find in other countries. So South America here is not distinctive with respect to the organization and the classification of the characters that we used. All right, to summarize the results, one of the ways to think about these results is that the usual depiction of the wise person as someone who is essentially a thinker gets something right, right? So this depiction that a wise person is someone like Socrates or I think it's Confucius, I believe, but I'm not 100% sure. Those people are first and foremost characterized by their reflectiveness. They are people who essentially are thinkers. And our results suggest that this depiction, this traditional depiction of the wise person as someone who is engaged in reflection, is grounded in an intuitive understanding of what it means to be wise. Empathy, or the understanding of emotion, is only a plus if one is already a reflective individual. The other finding is the relation between you and me. People view themselves as extremely high on empathy, but not that high, or intermediate in terms of reflectiveness. All right, this was the first study that shows the significance of reflection for the concept of wisdom in a surprising manner across cultures. The second study is about what it means to make a wise choice, and Veli talks briefly about it this morning. How do you make a wise choice? And that's the project of that study. Well, here is one way one can start thinking about what it means to make a wise choice. You can make a wise choice by considering the choice you have to make on your own, a self-focused strategy, an internal strategy. Or rather, you can ask advice. You can ask other people's opinion in order to make up your mind. It's, at the very least, two different ways in which one can try to make a choice. I think all of us have experience with both ways of making a decision. Sometimes we make a decision on our own. We have an intuition, an emotional reaction, and that guides us to our decision. Sometimes we actually are sampling our friends to know exactly what to do in that situation. If you do it on your own, you could maybe follow your thoughts, your reasoning, or maybe you could follow your heart, your intuition, right? You could say, well, how should I choose? Well, what do my gut feelings tell me to do? Or rather, you could say, well, like Darwin, I guess you all know that. So when Darwin had to decide whether to marry, he took a notebook, drew a line, put on one side minus, on the other side plus, and started to list reasons why it was a good and a bad thing to get married. And at the end of the day, the pluses were longer than the minus. So he married his wife. And it was a good choice because he spent his life happily with his wife. So you could follow Darwin, or rather you could follow your gut intuition, your gut feeling. If you ask advice, you could ask advice from close others, right? From your friends, from your family, from people you have that are part of your close network. Or rather, you could try to get opinions from as many people, the wisdom of crowds, right? You could try to get as many suggestions, as many pieces of advice as you can. So that gives us 4 strategies, 4 ways to try to make a choice. Do it on your own by following your gut feeling. Do it on your own by reasoning. Do it by asking advice from close others. Do it by asking advice from as many people as possible. Now, we're not saying this is the only 4 different ways one could make one could make a choice. There are, of course, many different ways one could make a choice, but that's the one we're focusing on in this paper. Here are our participants. We have 3 studies. Study 1 and study 3 differ from study 2 along the following dimension. When we describe the choice in study 1 and study 3, the 4 different strategies were exclusive from one another. If you follow your intuition, you're not following reasoning. If you follow reasoning, you're not following your intuition. If you ask your advice from close others, you're not asking advice for as many people as possible, right? By contrast, in study 2, we did not specify that these strategies were exclusive, right? So we let it possible that people could follow their intuition, but also ask for advice. Participants saw 6 vignettes, 2 in some sites when it was difficult to have people work for a very long time. They were presented with the 4 strategies I've described, and they were asked 4 questions about the strategy, and then they had a bunch of scales. So here's how it works. Participants read a short vignette. I think you've already seen that vignette this morning in Veli's talk, but I will read it again. Carlos, a young man, asked Marcos, his neighbor, if he can help him prepare his field to be able to plant before the rainy season. Marcos has already started working in his field a few weeks ago and knows that if he helps his neighbor Carlos, he will not be able to finish all the remaining work on time, and his harvest will not be as abundant as expected. And then you have a choice between the 4 different ways that Carlos could make up his mind about, that Marcos could make up his mind about what to do. The first 2 are internal, they're self-focused. The second one involves asking advice. The first one is focused on reasoning. Marcos spends some time reasoning and reflecting on the situation on his own. Marcos reasons about the situation, his personal experiences, and his thought. Marcos then makes his decision based on his thought and reasoning, even if it does not align with his gut feelings. This is the exclusion bit, right? Or with what others may think about the situation. So intuition, Marcos spends sometimes tuning in to his feelings and emotion about the situation on his own. Marcos attends to his gut feeling about the situation, his personal experiences, and his emotions. Marcos then makes his decision based on his gut feeling, even if it does not align with his thoughts and reasoning, or with what others may think about the situation. Close others, Marcos spends some time getting the opinion of his friends about the situation. Marcos describes the situation to his friend. His friends listen and offer advice. The advice his friends give about the situation varies. Marcos then makes his decision based on his friend's advice, even if it does not align with his thoughts and reasoning, or with his gut feeling about the situation. And the wisdom of crowd strategy. Marcos spent some time getting the opinions of a number of strangers about the situation. Marcos posts an anonymous question online describing the situation. People read about the situation and offer advice. The advices people give about the situation varies. Marcos then makes his decision based on the stranger's most common advice, even if it does not align with his thoughts and reasoning or with his gut feeling about the situation. Again, in the second study, we removed the exclusionary aspect, right? We didn't specify that the strategy might be at odds with the other strategy. And so participants read the text. They have 6 vignettes. For each of the vignettes, they have to decide, they have to choose one of these 4 strategies about how to make a decision. So, for example, they have to say which way of making a decision do you consider the wisest? So what is a wise choice? Does it involve following your gut feeling, following your reasoning, asking the advice of close others, asking the advice of many strangers? What would you do? It's your own preference. And then what would most people do in your cultural setting, right? So what would most French people do? What would I do? And what I consider to be wise? And then we ask them, as Veli commented and criticized this morning, we asked them to what extent they were satisfied with these 4 different ways of making the choice. All right, so here are the results. That is part of the results. So what you see here are the 3 studies, study 1 and study 3 being similar to one another, except they involve different samples. Study 2 is the same as study 1 and study 3, except they don't have the exclusionary bit in the description of the choice. So what you see here is a distribution of answer in a dark blue or dark purple is a choice of the wisdom of crowds, a proportion of choice of the wisdom of crowds across sample. As you can see, people everywhere find it's just not what they like to do, right? People really dislike and find it unwise to make a choice by means of a sampling of opinions of strangers. The second one, which actually was a surprise, is the friend's advice. So there's some variation across countries, but as you can see, it's not the most common answer that's preferred, and it's not the most common answer that's judged wise. The most common answer in nearly all the samples, but 1 and 2, is in fact reasoning. So the modal answer, the most common answer, the answer that most people choose for themselves and to be the wisest, is the one that involves thinking through the answer. People would rather make a choice by thinking through the question. And that's true in all of the studies, both when we specify as an exclusion and when we don't specify. Rather than asking advice, rather than following their intuition, rather than doing a poll of strangers. And then the last one is following intuition. So the most common answer in all the sample with what people would do and what is a wise choice is actually to reason, to think through the problem. Right. Again, it should echo a little bit what we started with in the study I described earlier, where the picture of the wise individual is centered around reflection. So here, again, the picture of the wise choice is centered around thinking through the problem in order to get the best answer. Another way to look at the data is to compare the internal choices, so deliberation and intuition, with the external choices. And as you can see, in all the samples, with some variation, however, in all the samples, people do prefer an internal way of making a choice compared to an external way of making a choice. Of interest here are maybe the Shipibo in Peru and the Chihuahua in Ecuador, which give quite similar answer to one another. And in both cases, people say that they themselves would actually prefer to choose by means of an internal strategy rather than an external strategy, in at least the kind of scenario we've been using. We can now compare two of the questions, the one involving how most people would be behaving, that's in red, and what is a wise decision, that's in blue, for when it involves using an internal strategy. Most people think that a wise decision, in most samples, people think that a wise decision involves following an internal strategy. This is what is considered to be acting wisely. However, interestingly, they believe that most other people would actually follow an unwise strategy. They would follow an external strategy. They themselves, on the contrary, would of course be very wise and follow either their reasoning and their thoughts. Right? So that's a case, again, a little bit similar to what we saw earlier, where people think of themselves as actually being wise and think of other people as being unwise and as following an unwise strategy. So there is some variation, however, in the data, and we try to understand where this variation comes from. Using some of the scales that we had been using. And we can use scales at the group level, at the site levels, or we can use scale at the individual level. And you get the same type of results if you look both at the group and individual level. What predicts the preference for an internal strategy is both at the group level and individual level, what is known as your individualism. What predicts your preference for thinking on your own, being separated from your community. What predicts an external strategy, both at the group level and individual level, is a measure called collectivism. So countries or sites that are more collectivistic and individuals that shows a higher collectivism on this measure, whatever it's worth, happens to prefer an external strategy, which is in a way what you would be expecting. While sites and individuals that shows an individualistic strategy prefer an internal strategy. Again, this is really what you would be expecting. We also had some data about subjective utility, whether people would be satisfied with the choice they had made. And again, everywhere people would be more satisfied by using an internal strategy compared to an external strategy. But there too, there's some interesting variation across countries. Notice here that both the Chihuahua and the Shipibo are in fact quite aligned with the average response, right? They don't really differ from the average response, and they're not particularly different from what you find among Spanish-speaking undergraduates, the students here, and both in Peru and in Ecuador, right? So there's no real differences here between indigenous treatment of this question from Spanish-speaking students. They have the same attitude toward what a wise choice really amounts to. Again, I should say, this lack of variation surprised us tremendously. When we designed that study, and if you look at what we say online about this study, we were expecting tremendous variation. In fact, our bet was that there would be great variation in what people prefer, great variation in what people think is a wise way of making a decision. We expected that Americans would be super high onto, I do it on my own. We expected maybe some people in Asia, some groups in Asia, and maybe some indigenous group to be much more favoring an external strategy. So that's what our predictions. In fact, we find the opposite. We find a surprising amount of convergence into favoring an internal strategy for themselves and also thinking it is a wise thing to do. Now, to summarize the results, just like in the previous study, we did find that a wise decision is one that involves the self, and within the self, the one that involves thinking first. Nonetheless, we did find some variation predicted by this measure called collectivism versus individualism, both at the group level and at the individual level. And just like in the previous study, we find an interesting fact about the you-me asymmetry, where people think of themselves as making wise choices. They will act according to an internal strategy, and they will think through the problem, which is a wise thing to do. Other people, not so much. Right? And that's a common bias in social psychology, where we view ourselves as immune from the biases, and we view others as falling prey to the biases. There's a large literature in social psychology about this bias, and we find it here again in our studies. So it's quite converging with a large amount of work on ignoring one's biases and thinking that others are more biased than one is. All right. So this is a kind of example of what we've been doing. Now, an obvious thing that should be emerging is that we started with the assumption that we would find quite a bit of variation across culture, and we do find some variation. We had hypothesized, and to be honest, we were hoping, at least I was hoping, to find striking variation in conceptions of wisdom across groups. Particularly, I was hoping East-West, industrialized, non-industrialized, would show really dramatic variation. While we do find some variations, that's noteworthy, some of which we can make sense of, not all of which, I think the variation we observe is actually much less than what I was expecting, and again, to be honest, hoping to find. All right. So let me discuss a little bit, just to summarize, at least based on our data, a wise person that's wise is first and foremost a reflective individual and also an empathetic person. But empathy only contributes to wisdom to the extent that one is reflective. In itself, being empathetic does not contribute to wisdom in any clear way. And very much in line with this characterization of what a wise person is, making a wise choice is a choice that expresses oneself. It involves expressing who one really is. And who one really is often characterized by one's reflection. And that, again, is found in pretty much all the places we've been looking at, with some interesting variation. Now, we did find some variability. So, I mentioned two forms of variation, which I want to reiterate right now. The first one is the association between reflectiveness and empathy, right? At some places, the two really go together like a glove in a hand. Is the case of Asia, for example, Japan, Korea, and China, where being high in reflectivity means being high in empathy, and vice versa. Other places, to some extent, Peru and also Morocco, the two are much less, they're still correlated, there's still positive correlation between the two dimensions, but the correlation is much weaker. It's a third of the correlation we find in Asia. The second variation is the role of collectivism and individualism in predicting a preference for an internal strategy or an external strategy when it comes to choosing a course of action and to judging that a course of action is wise. And again, this is exactly what one would have been expected. Collectivist people and collectivist sites tend to prefer external strategies, and vice versa for individual people and individual sites. There's a tremendous amount of individual variation. Is that something that anyone who has done some cross-cultural work is, obviously very sensitive to, is that the most important form of variation is individual variation, and that's true in our data as well. Now, we have a handle on some of these variations. Some of this variation is driven by individual measures, such as collectivism and individualism. But in general, we don't really know where this individual variation comes from. So I think it's important to keep in mind that while, to simplify, I talk of what it means to be a wise person, what it means to make a wise choice. In fact, there's much more variation in the data that is unexplained, that is really not captured by anything. I think it's really quite important not to be misled by the summary of the study I'm providing here. So variation is real. Now, something I've been trying to do in preparing this talk is to try to think about why, given that we had hypothesized and hoped that to find variation, why is it the case that we did not find any variation in the study, or little variation, I should say, in the studies we ran about wisdom? And the answer is that I don't know. And the best I can offer are some speculations. So bear with me, I'm going to offer some speculations. The first one is that it's very simple. To be wise is to be reflective. And people who are not reflective make a lot of mistakes in their lives. They lead an unhappy life. And as a result, people learn that wisdom involves being reflective. So the first explanation is very simple. It's just a matter of observing what's around you and learning. And it's not an unreasonable hypothesis. But on second thought, it's just not going to work very well. Because we also know that people who are reflective might be indecisive. And there's such a thing as a stereotype of the person who spends his time to think through matters and is never able to act. Or we let the moment pass, and as a result, we'll be unable to grasp good occasions in her action, right? So it's a bit unclear when one looks at the facts whether there's a deep association with making good choices, having a good life, being a prudent individual, and being reflective. So learning does not strike me to be the right answer. Maybe a better answer is biased learning. So it's not that really that in the world, people who are reflective tend to be wiser. It's more that when we collect instances of having a good life, we tend to focus on people who've been reflective. And why is that? Well, because one might think that people who are emotional and as a result have bad outcomes happen to them, you make a rash decision, you make an emotional decision. Those people are very salient because emotions are attention grabbing, right? We see someone being angry and doing something foolish as a result. And we have a lot of memories of bad decisions that are driven by quick, non-reflective decision-making processes. So it's not like in the real world, reflectiveness leads to wisdom and lack of reflectiveness leads to lack of wisdom. It's rather that these are the cases that are very salient to us. So it's kind of biased learning, right? There's a bias in the type of evidence we're collecting about the relation between reflectiveness and wisdom, lack of reflectiveness and lack of wisdom. Now, it's a possibility. On the other hand, it does not really tell us much about wise choice and why people prefer intuition and gut feeling to other ways of making a decision. So that's, that might be part of the story, this idea of biased learning, but I don't think it can be the whole story. Something else that came to my mind when I was trying to look for possible explanation is just ideology. In many places, people who belong to the higher social classes, it was true, of course, in ancient Greece, where some of the fundamental notions of wisdom in the West were developed. It's true in China, where some of the most fundamental conceptions of wisdom were developed. It's true in India, also, where there's a lot of reflection on wisdom. In many of these places, there's a great similarity between who has power and who happens to be wise. Who has power tend people who are reflective. People who have gone through education. These are men in Athens who are wealthy and they have time to discuss ideas. These are the bureaucrats in China, in the Confucian tradition, who have been selected for their education. So one idea is that it's not learning, it's not biased learning. Our conception of wisdom is really an expression of the self-reflection of the higher social classes in many social environments. So wherever you find a relation between education and higher social classes, you might be led to expect that the portrait of wisdom is going to be centered around reflection, because it happens that in those parts of the world, so higher social classes are the ones who have the leisure to be educated, to think, to express themselves in their choices, to reflect about the world around them. Now, I think this is a possible hypothesis. I don't know whether it's true, but I think it does fit our data quite well. I'm sure there are other speculations, and I'm inviting further speculations in the Q&A. So last thing I want to do before finishing, because I'm already at the 1 hour mark, is to highlight some of the limitations of the work. There are many limitations, and actually I could spend another hour talking about the limitations. One of them is, which was mentioned very briefly earlier in my talk, is sort of the haphazard nature of the sample we worked with. We use samples of convenience, people we knew, and we met new acquaintances, new friends. But there was no real principal reflection in how we composed, or no systematic anyway reflection in how we composed our sample. And I think that's a limitation of the project. Another one which I think worries me quite a bit is, and that's something that Veli is really concerned with, is the fact that our stimuli mostly come from a Western perspective. Now, the vignettes we use, for example, in study 2, we really try to make some of them meaningful for a diverse audience. But some of the choice options that, as Veli discussed this morning, are maybe driven by the expectations of many of us, Western expectations. Some of the characters we use in the first study maybe are not sufficiently diverse in terms of what we would be expecting to find in other settings. So there's definitely a Western bias in the studies we've been conducting. I think that's an interesting limitation of the project. Something that worries me quite a bit is the second point here, is that I worry that some of the methods we've been using, both to collect data and to analyze data, prevent us from finding variation that is there. It might be that having 19 dimensions that we've chosen in the first study and reducing this 19 dimension to 2 underlying dimensions, in fact, prevent us from finding any interesting variation that could be there to be found. And actually, I'm quite concerned with this limitation of the project. And there are much more things to be said. All right. To summarize, in contrast to what we had expected, there's a surprising amount of convergence in how at least wisdom is understood. So we didn't provide much support from the diversity challenge that was at the root of this project. In fact, where there is variation, convergence is really the main lesson that we can draw from this project. To conclude, I would like to thank the John Templeton Foundation, which has been extremely generous. The project lasted for 6 years. They were kind enough to extend the project during COVID, give us more money. We were able to support postdoctoral fellows much longer than what we had expected at the beginning. So we're actually extremely grateful for the support they've given us over this quite long period. And also, most important, I want to thank my collaborators. I want to thank Jörg Grossman, because he is the psychologist who has been leading the studies I've described today. So I think I should really acknowledge his contribution to the project. And most important today, I want to thank the team here in Peru, which has been amazing collaborators, among, in fact, the best collaborators we've been working with over this quite long period. So thanks Pablo, and Emanuele Fabiano, who was Pablo's postdoc here who is now in Spain, Italy? Spain? Portugal, close enough. Who is now in Portugal, and I think both of them were wonderful collaborators. But also, I should also mention their collaborators, because they were able to work with a lot of people to collect the data, including in indigenous settings. So I think it should be acknowledged that this work would not have been possible without the collaborators, including in the indigenous settings. So I'm also grateful for that. All right, thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Edouard Machery por su presentación. Y pasamos al tiempo de preguntas que pueda tener la audiencia. No sé si hay alguien que quiere preguntar. Empezamos.
¿Qué tal? Buenas. Mi nombre es Rodrigo González y quería preguntar en inglés. I will read my question because if I improvise, it would be chaos. Well, last year you wrote an article about common sense as a bad guide to reality.
Right, yeah.
In that article you talk about thought experiments, using different extreme situations to know more about ethics and morality on people, and how you don't recommend the use of those tools so they are still being used. because they don't consider the different environments of people asked to resolve them. Is this the case? Are these thought experiments and common sense related? I think they are linked too, but what I would like your answer about that is the thought experiments and common sense, how it is the process of people to decision in extreme situations, cases, linked to the study you just presented us.
Great. So, in this paper, I argue, as many of you know, philosophers, particularly analytic philosophers, are very fond of thought experiments. They use thought experiments all the time to theorize about the right, the wrong, knowledge, and so on and so forth. And for many years, I've been a critic, as you kindly point out, of the use of thought experiments, mostly on the ground that as soon as one looks beyond professional philosophers, often one finds a tremendous diversity in people's reaction to this thought experiment. It's not true of all thought experiments, but it's commonly true of many thought experiments. And in my work for now 20 years, and some of my empirical work that I used to do quite a lot of, I've been trying to demonstrate that the usual thought experiments in philosophy elicit great diversity. So that's what this paper is about. Now, the research today is connected to this idea, but not in a straightforward manner. So we look at the same concepts, concept of knowledge that I've done some work on, concept of understanding and wisdom, but we don't use weird thought experiments of the kind that philosophers are very fond of. For example, when we work on a wise choice, instead of using totally strange thought experiment about Martians who must decide between the end of the world and some other stuff, we use commonsensical everyday situations, right? Such as someone decided whether to help a friend at his own cost or not. So situations that are much more familiar, that are the kind of things that people have an experience to think about. They've made decisions when it comes to this kind of situation. So the main contrast between the work I've done on thought experiments and this work is that the vignettes, the cases we use, are much more commonsensical. And one of my views on this matter is that with each concept, we have a domain of application for which we are actually quite competent. Right? So there are, for example, for the concept of knowledge, I think I'm very competent to distinguish people who know from people who don't know in some domains. Right? I can tell when my students don't know what I've taught them. Right? They come to my office, I ask them a few questions, and I say, you don't know what you're supposed to know. And I'm pretty reliable in making that kind of judgment. However, if you give me a weird thought experiment, it's beyond the domain of application of my concept. There, I become much less reliable. I don't have a way to apply the concept in a reliable manner. So I think the thought experiments are beyond the domain of application, and that's why you get diversity. That's why people in different places answer differently. By contrast, in this fairly commonsensical situation, I think it's within the domain of application. So people are more reliable in the way they apply their concept. So that's a similarity and differences between my previous work on thought experiment and this work where the situation we described were intentionally chosen to be easily graspable, commonsensical, meaningful to the extent that we could make them meaningful in a study.
They were not based on extreme situations.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. So we didn't choose extreme situation, Clark was largely instrumental in moving us away from the weirdness of thought experiments in a way to study people's concepts, right? And I think this is indeed to the benefit of the project. We're not going to learn a whole lot about how people think about knowledge, wisdom, by giving them very weird situations about which they've never given any thought. Right? You're only going to get ad hoc answers, weird answers that they don't really know what to say. So they find a way to answer your questions. right? So I think that's exactly right. We avoided this extreme situation and weird situations. Yeah.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Sí, aquí.
Good afternoon. I am Carlos. I arrived yesterday from Italy, so I am an anthropologist. I study at the Turin University, and also I work as a cultural mediator. So for me, what you explained today is really interesting in that, because it's a challenge also for working in the interdisciplinary, with an interdisciplinary view. And also I am so curious because in some way you also touch the theory of the biopsychosocial that the first time that I listened was in the Amsterdam University. Something that I am very curious because as you talk also about variation, and also I was reflecting for the fact that, for example, what means suffering, or what does mean, or in what way you can reach or get the happiness. In my case, for example, working in interculturality is really complex when we talk about what conditions you need to be happy. If you talk with Arab people, in Asian people is quite different, and Latin America also. Yep. So I think in that is really important to try to get a complex knowledge to get the understanding of people of different cultures. And that is something in that a new knowledge that maybe we need to try to produce for the future of the societies.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think happiness is actually a great example where the question of variation has practical significance, right? So, different ideals of what it means to be happy will lead to very different expectations about what people should be doing, how to help people. And if we ignore this variation, we're actually bound to harm people, really. And also we are bound to misunderstand discussion between groups, right? We might not understand why people from different backgrounds might not converge onto a consensus. It's because they understand things like happiness, which I think is a great example, very, very differently. There's one study looking at knowledge, comparing Asia, it's in the business world, I don't know whether I believe it, but it's interesting enough, arguing that some of the disagreement between Americans and mostly Chinese companies in the business world are driven by different understanding of what it means to know something. And that leads actually to different behavior, different risk, different group of risk. I don't know whether it's true, but this is the kind of stuff where variation has possibly, at the very least, and in the case of happiness, surely, some very practical implications. Yeah. So I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I mean, I was expecting wisdom to be much more like happiness, to be honest. I was expecting somehow what it means to be a wise person, what it means to act wisely, to be more related to the variation which I think you observe for happiness. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Maria?
Hi. I'm not sure if I'm right, but I think you haven't looked at all the data from all the communities, because I was wondering maybe here in Peru, the Urarina may behave differently because they're more isolated from,
correct,
and the Shipibo are, more integrated. So maybe if you look at all the smaller data of the smaller groups, you'll find more differences.
Yeah, no, we don't have this data. It's worth remembering that we did the studies during COVID. So somehow, there was a world event that stood in the way of doing everything we were hoping to do. It's totally possible that indeed there's more variation across groups. That's what we've been able to observe. Indeed, I agree with you. Yeah, I think
there's hope to find more.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it would be nice to, for example, look at integration to the broader society as a variable. It might be that the less integrated you are to a society, the more divergent your pattern of answer is. And we haven't done that kind of work. I'm not sure exactly we would know how to measure that, but yes, I think this is absolutely true. Yeah.
I had another question, but I just forgot it.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh yes. Why do you think that people feel they make wise decisions and they feel everybody else makes decisions for the wrong reasons or for external?
Yeah.
Do you have any explanation for that?
I don't. I find it interesting. It's interesting that it shows in nearly all samples but one. It does not show. I should have highlighted it. Actually, a sample from Ecuador, actually. Yeah. No, it's a previous slide. Yeah, this one. So the only exception to the pattern is among the Shiwiya in Ecuador. And I don't know, maybe Clark can talk to this reversal. But everywhere else, it's really quite striking how stable the pattern is. I mean, it's I think quite unusual to find something like in 12, 15 different samples, systematic result. And I don't know why. But I think it's a real phenomenon.
Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Sí.
We can translate, yes?
Sí.
Sí.
Mi pregunta es acerca de, porque ya el nombre de geografía y la filosofía está suponiendo que, digamos, todos los pueblos tienen filosofía, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, y esto es desde la antropología, entonces es una definición positiva digamos, de la filosofía, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, lo que se podría objetar, digamos, es si realmente todos los pueblos tienen filosofía y si filosofía es lo mismo que sabiduría, ¿no? Porque pues la sabiduría, digamos, puede tener contenidos religiosos, mágicos, teológicos, de distinto tipo, ¿no? Entonces, si decimos que la filosofía nace gracias a las ciencias, nace gracias a la matemática, que es la primera ciencia, la geometría, pues, y que la geometría es axiomática, ¿no? En ese caso, pues no todos los pueblos tienen filosofía, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, mi pregunta va un poco por ahí, ¿no? Si ustedes ya están presuponiendo que todos los pueblos tienen filosofía, o si no lo tienen.
Pablo, can you give me your hand? Sorry? Can you give me your hand?
Yeah, so the question is, it seems that the name, the geography of philosophy, hides a sort of presupposition. The assumption is that every community has philosophy. So he's questioning that assumption. So whether we make this connection, this link between philosophy and wisdom. So maybe the assumption is false.
That's a great question. I don't think we're assuming there is philosophy everywhere. What I think I'm assuming, and I want to talk for my co-PI and collaborators, is that there are philosophical concepts everywhere. So the concept of knowledge, which is a concept we philosophers have thought about for centuries, I think is found everywhere in the world because it's a very useful marker for distinguishing various types of mental states. I think the concept of wisdom I'll be more careful here, might be found in many different places. Maybe it requires specific ecology or sociocultural. So I don't think philosophy as an exercise of systematic thinking is going to be found everywhere. It might or might not, there's partly a terminological question there, but even if you think philosophy as a way of arguing, developing a systematic web of ideas is not found everywhere, some philosophical concepts, I think, are found in pretty much every culture that we know of. Right, wrong, fair, just. And I think concerns about these concepts are universal. Is the distribution fair? Did I get less than I was entitled to? Did you do wrong to me? Did you act rightly? You said so. Did you know it when you said it? All of these questions, I think, are pretty much universal questions that people, as soon as you put two human beings together, if they're not too lazy, at some point they're going to start asking, but did you really know what you were saying me? Were you right to do this and that? Is it fair to divide the amount of resources this way or that way? I think it's unavoidable that people will come to ask this kind of question. Maybe it's not philosophy because it's less systematic, but it involves a philosophical concept, it involves reflection about philosophical topics. So that's what I want to say, right? Philosophy might not be universal. Philosophical concept, philosophizing, maybe, might be something that's found very widely. But it's an excellent question. And that's a presupposition. And I think I'm willing to defend it.
¿Alguna pregunta más? I can ask a question. So you have this, your answer to his question is, well, yeah, you're not presupposing that philosophy is universal or that every community has philosophy, but you're presupposing that every community has philosophical concepts like knowledge or wisdom. But now here's something that is puzzling for me is, so you started with a hypothesis that you would find big differences, big divergence between cultures, right? With the notion of wisdom, okay? Now, my puzzle is the following. If you assume that every community has the philosophical concept of wisdom, there must be a convergence somewhere because of the following reason. Suppose you find huge diversity in the way people understand wisdom. What would make you call that sort of thing that is going on that is very different from what we might call wisdom?
And I think it's a fair question. Indeed, so if we find a place where some ideal is, for example, related to being extremely brash, being violent, being driven by emotion, like the Nietzschean picture of the German beast that Nietzsche loves to describe. And if that's the ideal of behavior, we probably would not call that wisdom, right? We would not say, well, in that culture, we would say, well, they don't really have a concept of wisdom. They have another ideal that's just not being a wise person, it's being something else. So I think that's right. I mean, there's a question of what it means to recognize the same concept across different settings. I don't think we're begging the question, or maybe that's not really what you want to say, but I'm not sure that we are assuming from the get-go, we are building into the project lack of variation. Because between these two extremities, there are a lot of intermediate options that we're all very familiar with, right? So we go to a country and we have a word for toy, and we go to another cultural setting, and they have a word that we are used to translate with our word toy. Except somehow the extension of this word is not exactly the same as ours. It's actually overlapping to a large extent. So inferences that people draw when they call something a toy in their language are similar but not the same as the one we draw in our language, right? They might say, for example, they might say, yeah, you can make, I'm not sure exactly what inference you might want to say. Maybe sport a better example. But some of the inferences that are involving this concept are similar, others are different. So one might say there's a familiarity resemblance between the concept here and the concept there, right? And I think this is more the type of situations I was expecting. Now here you've got an open question. Do they have a concept of toy, or do they have a concept of wisdom, or not? I think there's no principled way of answering this kind of question. I'm very skeptical about individuating concept in a principled manner. I think what really matters is to get a sense of the diversity of inferences concepts are used in, also the extensions, supposing that you judge categorization judgments to be a measure of extension of a concept. And I think this is the more likely situation I was sort of expecting, where it would not be completely separated, such that it would be really puzzling to call that knowledge, wisdom, whatever. But it would be interestingly different. There would be overlap, but if possible, quite limited. And in fact, you could imagine a situation where you have, just like for some species, you have a constant degree of overlap, such that the extremes don't overlap anymore. This is a totally conceivable situation, both for extension and inferential practices. And that gives you some reason to think, well, we're talking about the same thing, except it turns out at the end of the extreme is quite different from one another. Anyway, so this is a sort of practical situation. I don't think you can give a principled answer about when you're going to find a given concept, because it requires theory of concept individuation. No one has ever had one, and no one will ever have one. Mm-hmm. So this is, in a way, I was trying to have when Stitch, I, and Clark were trying to think about some of these questions, we talked a lot about that very question. It was, right from the beginning, we were very worried about that exact question, what it meant, what we were assuming. But I think our answers was, we need a practical solution rather than a principal solution to this kind of question. Mm-hmm. Right? The one I gave you.
Well, can I?
Yep, go ahead.
Follow up. So I want to get a sense of what we are learning with this empirical data and what we're not. So this is a philosophical project,
that's
right?
It's interdisciplinary project.
Yeah, interdisciplinary.
Philosophical.
Yeah, but the diversity challenge is
it's philosophical. That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I guess if you find some variation, that's a counterexample to a claim that says, or that entails that there's no variation at all. Okay, now you have a case, a counterexample, okay, to that claim. Now I doubt that anybody would say something like that in philosophy, but maybe someone. The more common claim that you might find in philosophical circles is not that there is just one single concept that has a very borders that are completely clear-cut. What you will find is that we have certain constraints, and there is variation, right? But we have constraints. Otherwise, we are talking about a completely different phenomenon, and we have no reason to call that knowledge or to call that wisdom, right? We have some constraints, and we have a space where we can disagree and all that. In fact, if you go to a philosophy department and you ask what is knowledge, people will not agree on their answers, right? Although they will find that there are certain constraints that such that those other things are not knowledge. Whatever knowledge is, they're not, right? So if that's the case, then I'm wondering, surely this is important work, but I want to come back to the philosophical challenge. How does this data contribute to settling or to get a clearer picture of what's going on philosophically speaking?
Good. So I think really what matters here is the extent of variation. So even if I quite agree with you, I think why I don't think it's quite right that everyone agrees that there's pictures about variation under constraint. I don't think Tim Williamson thinks it's the right way to think about knowledge. But I think reasonable people, excluding Williamson, do agree with your characterization about what indeed variation under constraint is probably the right way to think about conceptual diversity. I think the nature of the constraint and how constraining they are matters quite a bit. The looser they are, the more diverse the familiar resemblance connection between various users they are, the stronger the diversity challenge becomes. Just to come back to Gilligan's argument is very powerful. I think she's wrong about the empirical fact, but had she been right about the empirical fact, the argument was extremely powerful because men and women are largely sensitive, on her view anyway, to different ethical considerations. One that involve interpersonal relation, women, one that involves that remove interpersonal relation from the domain of justice and right and wrong. Mm-hmm. So while there are similarities, of course, between the views, the extent of the differences made that as a genuine challenge from the way you're theorizing about right and wrong. Mm-hmm. I think the same would be true for knowledge, the same would be true for wisdom, the same would be true for, basically how constraining the constraints are, I think is where the empirical facts matter for the philosophical significance of the empirical findings. Now, what we found is actually much less variation than what we had expected. So in some ways, I think it's bad news for the diversity challenge. I think the diversity challenge is not supported, at least by this type of findings that we have. In fact, at least when it comes to wisdom, there's very little variation. I mean, there is some variation, but it's just bad news for the diversity challenge. So it's actually good news. Now, bracketing the question that there's a lot of human beings around there, but it's not a good news for the diversity challenge. In fact, it does suggest that people tend to think about wisdom in quite similar ways across, and actually in ways that are actually fitting quite well with what Confucius had said about wisdom, to some extent, that is not the details obviously, but it's a broad orientation with what Aristotle says about wisdom as well, not the details again. But yeah, so I think the outcome is that if we had found much looser constraint, would have been supporting the diversity challenge. The fact that we find some but not extensive variation is actually a challenge to kind of ideas that Steve Stitch have been pushing for decades. Yeah. So that's I think the way I can see what lesson to draw from this project. And again, I mean, I started with the opposite hope, right? I mean, the whole, when we developed this project, one of the things I was hoping to find is tremendous diversity in these concepts. And I had a goal to write a book on this topic, and somehow human beings are very disappointing. So they all look the same. So at least in this domain.
Okay, good. ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Yeah. Shall we go to that?
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Ok, démosle las gracias a nuestro invitado especial.
Thank you very much.